Welcome to Teaching in Action, where research meets real classrooms. I'm Samantha Calandrino, and today I'm diving into a fantastic journal article that caught my attention and got me thinking about how we can bring theory to life. In this episode, we'll unpack the key ideas from planning universal design inquiry science lessons for students with complex support needs and explore what research has found. And most importantly, I'll share how I plan to take those insights straight into my own classroom. So grab your coffee, settle in, and let's turn academic findings into classroom reality. Dive into this article. The article actually presents a systematic approach for special education teachers to actually plan a high quality inquiry based science instruction for students with complex support needs. The article really integrates three main frameworks for an effective lesson plan for the science inquiry. I think in science and in any classroom, we talk about to do all these things and to create an engaging lesson, to create a lesson that shows student engagement, to shows student learning. And the how is the part that many of us struggle on, and even myself. So I really enjoy that this article actually highlights the how we can actually lesson plan and plan ahead to actually hit those students with complex support needs. So the three frameworks that are really mentioned in this article are the multi-dimensional science standards, the inquiry-based teaching, especially the 5 E's of instructional model, and the universal design for learning, or UDL. So we're going to go through each one of those and tell how I would implement in the classroom, because it's easier to say, but actually showing you how to implement in the classroom is the most important skill to take away. So the multidimensional science standards states that it is built upon many different science standards, right? So like your NJSS practices, your core ideas, your Common Core, your cross-cutting concepts, right? And the goal is to actually move students with these complex support needs beyond just vocab and actually talking about real dimensional concepts. So it's actually implying that teaching these standards will go beyond the teaching tradition, right? And then we're arguing that the 5 E's is actually the best framework to naturally incorporate these three-dimensional student-led inquiry-based lessons. So we'll talk a little bit about the 5 E's in a minute. So how we actually implement this multi-dimensional science standards is investigating and explaining real-world phenomena, real-world phenomenons by using science practices and cross-cutting concepts. So if we start with a phenomenon, right, we can talk about if we're using cellular respiration, which is the next unit in for my students, we can talk about marathon runners, right? Why do they eat so much carbohydrates the night before a race? And this is a really good question. It's a good hook, and it also plays into a lot of interests of many students who run cross country, run track, so they may be able to relate to these sort of things. And then from there, we have our science practices where we can actually analyze data from doing a class experiment. And then our cross-cutting concepts is actually tracing, right, the amount of flow from glucose to carbon dioxide to water and energy transformation from chemical energy to heat throughout this process. So talking about multiple different concepts into one lesson, starting with our phenomenon, our scientific practice, and then cross-cutting between concepts. So next we'll talk about the instructional model, the 5 E's, right? This model talks about engaging, exploring, explaining, elaborate, and evaluating, okay? With this MISS model, we are actually also ensuring accessibility through the UDL principle in these, which we'll talk about next. So we want to weave in these three-dimensional, multi-dimensional science standards with our inquiry-based teaching. And so if I'm using the phenomenon that I talked about earlier with cellular respiration and marathon runners, I may actually show them a video of a runner struggling during their last mile of a marathon, right? And kind of giving them like what's happening, something that is observable, something that we can actually see and make inferences and talk about it in discussion. And that would be my engage. So getting my students engaged in this conversation and this phenomenon. My second step of the five E's would be explore. So this is talking about multiple means of action and expression. This would be like a hands-on experiment where groups are using sealed test tubes with yeast and very different sugar solutions to actually measure the amount of carbon dioxide that's fermented over time, right? And so students can actually plan, carry out their investigation, and analyze and interpret their data by graphing the CO2 productions and things like that. And in this opportunity, they could be given sentence starters, they could be given graphic organizers, pre-made data tables, and things like that to help with the complex support needs. The third E is going to be explain. So this is where teachers, you may want to lead, right? A teacher facilitated discussion where students will share their data and observations. And then that's when we're introducing chemical equations, key organelles, and students might actually use the claim evidence reading, the CER framework, to explain what's going on. And this is also introduced in the article, how they talk about it that way. And so the fourth E, the fourth is elaborate. And we kind of, this one, I like to incorporated the elaborate and the evaluate kind of together because they kind of go very similar and hand in hand, especially in like how I would implement this. So you can actually have students to apply their knowledge to this new concept, and they would actually analyze the different foods, right? A runner should eat versus and what happened. So like a fat versus a carbohydrate. So taking what we learned and did the experiment on, and now we're actually elaborating on this and saying, well, what's the difference between a fat and a carbohydrate and how that plays a role in cellular respiration. And then during this is where teachers can actually do a assessment, a formal informal assessment, to actually see how they're using their CER framework to their food recommendations to this runner. So as mentioned, the UDL is something that we want to make sure is incorporated in those 5 E's as well. So when we talk about the UDL, we're talking about the providing options, right? Sustainable effort, helping students to actually self-regulate, and motivating them by offering choices to increase their learning. So we talk about the why we learn, we talk about the what we learn, and we talk about how we learn. And we're using those key points to think about how we are making this student engaging, this lesson engaging, and how are we showing our knowledge. And so the article really pinpoints and says that this principle, the why we learn, focuses on sustainable effort and helping students to motivate them by choices so they can learn that's what's relevant, personally relevant to them. So if I, for example, I'm going to use my UDL, keeping in mind in the explore stage, to allow students to choose which variable they want to test. So if that's sugar, temperature, or the amount of yeast, to actually determine their highest respiration rate during this process. For my what we learn, right, this article really emphasizes that presenting information in different formats is making sure that students can perceive and comprehend these really core concepts that we're trying to make them hit and understand effectively. So this could be taught like pre-teaching vocab like ATP, the mitochondria with clear definitions and graphic organizers, right? This could be shown as written text, 3D models, graphic organizers, right? Showing them different types of means of representation for what we're trying to get them to learn. And then the how we learn is the article emphasizes that providing The article provides us with showing us how to create alternatives to demonstrate what they know, moving beyond one simple way, right? Like a paper test, right? Moving towards using their skill sets, right, that they already have to actually show us how they're learning. So for this, in the 5 E's, this can be used in the explain and evaluate phase where students can write they can write and full paragraphs, they can give in sentence starters, they can use any type of like communication device or drawings or a chart, a flow chart, a concept map to actually show what they know based on this experiment. Now, the article really emphasizes all these frameworks, but then it does a really nice job of putting these frameworks together to actually create an 8-step lesson planning process to effectively incorporate this in your classroom. Which I really liked about this article was because there is so much of this is what we need to do, this is what we need to include, but the how is what's really missing. And I think this article really gives us a breakdown of how we can implement this in our classrooms. So we're going to talk about 8 steps. The first one is determining our learning objectives. So we're going to start with our grade level standards, and we are going to identify how those expectations align with our students with complex support needs and really consider their prior knowledge. Next, we talk about that phenomenon, right? Getting them interested. So we are going to select a naturally occurring, observable, engaging event that will serve as the anchor and motivation for this lesson. Next, for step 3, we are going to consider their typical supports, interests, and their skills. So this would be reviewing any individual supports students already have. So if we're using like graphic organizers or using a whiteboard, and really emphasizing our UDL framework to proactively plan and embed these supports into our lessons. For step 4, this is where we hit the 5 E's. We're going to engage. So we're going to design a lesson that activating students' prior knowledge and sparking their interest to the phenomenon. Then for step 5, we're going to explore. So we're designing a student-led hands-on investigation where students are actually going to be observed, predict, and collect data and be able to generate questions through this. And remember, through this whole process, we're keeping in mind our UDL, right? So we're incorporating our actions and expressions and offering choices to be able to incorporate in this explore stage. For step 6, we're using the explain. We're going to determine how the teacher, so myself, will actually be able to guide students to their findings. And then for step 7, we are going to elaborate. So we're going to design an activity where students can apply their new knowledge, right, to another skill set and another investigation to expand on their knowledge. And then finally, for step 8, we're going to evaluate. So this is where we will informally assess or formally assess their knowledge. And this could be like monitoring discussions, reviewing their graphic organizers, or even looking at their statements, their CER statements. So much for joining me today in Teaching in Action. I think this was a very informative article that I viewed today, and we'll see what we plan on talking about next week.